Well, kia ora, and welcome to this week's edition of the Weekly Climate Wrap. We've had a couple of weeks off while I've been on family and sick leave, but it's great to be back with Cathrine Dyer, our climate correspondent. Cathrine, how are you?
Good. Kia ora, Bernard. Good to see you back on deck.
Yeah, no, I'm always looking forward for the latest on the climate news, and you've got a great wrap this week, which is going out with this video, and we'll talk about a few more of those things in a brief section on the whom. But firstly, LNG, which, along with natural gas, I suppose you'd call it, has been one of those so-called transition fuels promoted as a way to bridge the gap from oil and coal and then over to electric power. So it was the nice cut, the nice fossil fuel.
Yeah.
But is it so nice? What have we found out?
Well, so there's a study that came out. It was actually in preprint earlier in the year, which means that it hadn't been peer reviewed and published yet, but the authors had put it up online. And basically, this report was looking at liquefied natural gas, or LNG, in the US, and looking at how much methane was leaked through the whole process of mostly it's fracking, shale gas in the US, transporting it to export facilities, the process of liquefying it, transporting it, regasification at the other end, and distribution. And they found that as much as 5% of the gases leaked is methane during that process. And when you look at the total greenhouse gas footprint of LNG versus coal, burning coal for energy, for instance, they found that LNG had about 33% higher greenhouse gas impact over a 20-year time frame. Now, the 20-year time frame is important because we know that methane has much higher warming effects, up to 80 times higher in the short term, but then it disintegrates out of the air much quicker than carbon dioxide does. So carbon dioxide stays around for a lot longer. But the researcher Robert Howarth, his argument is that if you're claiming that it's going to be a bridging fuel, then you are bridging over some time period, presumably that critical time period when we need to be addressing, to global warming to make sure it doesn't go above 2 degrees. And so that 20-year time period is the appropriate time frame to compare their footprints. And so in that time frame, it would be better to burn coal than it is to burn LNG, basically.
This is the sort of shocking thing because, LNG seems so clean and modern and, we look at a nice blue flame and it all seems lovely. And the idea of that, we can get rid of that nasty, dirty coal seemed, intuitively a good thing. And as we know, the current government here in Aotearoa is super keen on gas and sees it as the solution to our winter hydro lake potential problems. Yet this research is saying actually it's dirtier than coal.
Well, yeah, and the further you have to ship it, the worse it gets. The other thing is he looked at a 100-year time frame, which is the more normal time frame that we usually look at global warming potential for different fossil fuels. And even over that time frame, it was about the same as gas. So over the very long term, it would definitely be less polluting than coal. But up to 100 years, it was about the same. And in 20 years, it was worse. The other interesting thing about all of this is that while this has been, it's hitting the headlines as a breakthrough new piece of research, and apparently it was instrumental in getting Biden to stop approvals for new gas exporting facilities in the US. It turns out that this is not new news. So that same researcher, Robert Howarth, first published an article in 2011 saying that gas was worse than coal. And he had some not dissimilar figures in it. He didn't include all of the export part of it. And he said that the case over 20 years was the same for conventional gas as it was for shale oil gas. So in New Zealand, what we have is conventional gas, not from fracking. That was 13 years ago. That was before the big boom in LNG and in fracking in the US even happened. And that piece of research got completely buried. It was highly criticised and jumped on by everybody in the industry and their paid researchers. They even to the point where the guy's computer was hacked and his article was stolen before it got published
Wow.
in 2011. You know, there was a whole pile on to try and bury that information so that the story about LNG as a bridging fuel could be told. And they managed to convince, governments like Barack Obama and before him, that it was a good idea to develop natural gas, LNG, and fracking as a way to secure energy independence for the US and to act as a bridging fuel elsewhere. So, this is a story about disinformation, and what we're seeing in the headlines at the moment is just the latest article and what it's, the ructions that it's causing currently in the industry. There's nobody that's kind of saying, hey, this was old information, actually. It's a new study and there's some new stuff in it, but the core claims are the same claims that were around 13 years ago and that got ignored and buried so that the whole industry could be developed and some people could make a lot of money whilst they were busy destabilising the climate and bringing us very, very close to some tipping points that are, what we are going to talk about next. We're right hard up against the edge of some potentially really devastating tipping points being crossed, and this sort of carry on where stuff that we knew about over a decade ago that gets buried and we damage the climate in the interim. That is the big story to my mind. That's the thing we really need to get talking about and really need to get to grips with the kind of power this information has in determining outcomes for all of us.
Has there been anyone identified as the hacker who stole the initial study?
The story that I found about it was on on his university website at Cornell. So it was kind of talking about history, and it just sort of said it was the oil and gas industry, but it didn't specifically, identify anybody or say that they'd been, taken to court or anything like that. It was just a comment that this had happened way back in his career.
Yeah, no, unfortunately there's form, and you're right. Timing matters now as we get closer and closer to very dangerous levels. Now tell us, there's a lot of talk about tipping points, and we know a few of them, and we'll talk about one more of them in the whom, but carbon sinks are one of those good measures that is helping us fight emissions or soak up some emissions. But what did we find out this week in a Guardian article in particular?
Yeah, so this is another one of those headlines that kind of comes and goes and doesn't maybe get as much traction as it ought to. So there was this great article in the Guardian, which we've linked to in the wrap. It's based again on another preprint, which is an academic study that has not been peer reviewed yet, but has been put up online because they think it's important and they want to get comments on it before it is fully published. It is an international group of researchers who found that that basically the amount of carbon that was absorbed by global land and ocean sinks in 2023 had collapsed. So one of their key findings, they found that the CO2 growth rate, as it's measured in the atmosphere at Mauna Loa in Hawaii, so they have a measurement station there, had increased, or the growth rate had jumped like 86% in 2023, which is a huge jump in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And then when they looked at global fossil fuel CO2 emissions, they'd only increased, like a fraction of that. And so there was kind of this, well, what is the problem here? What is the explanation for the gap between how much fossil fuels we emitted and how much ended up in the atmosphere? And what they found was that land sinks in particular had collapsed and that they weren't net absorbing CO2 in the way that they normally did. So what normally happens is about half of the CO2 that we emit into the atmosphere gets absorbed by land and ocean sinks combined. And then in addition to that, about 90% of the heat that's created by the remaining greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is absorbed by oceans as well. So a lot of the emissions that we create, we don't get the full impact of them because the whole of nature is doing a job of mopping up some of that. Now, if nature stops doing that job, we're in really big trouble. And in 2023, the land sinks didn't do that job. And what we don't really know at the moment, and we don't understand a lot about it, we don't really know if that is a temporary or a permanent thing. Like, have we reached some kind of tipping point and they're no longer going to absorb half of our CO2 emissions? Or was that just a temporary blip because there was a lot of fires, or, was there something in particular that caused it? So, and what the scientists are saying about this is actually we need to do more research. We don't know a whole lot about what the drivers are for this and why it happened that way. But what we do know is if the land sink has permanently stopped absorbing CO2, then we're in a lot of trouble. Like that could double the growth rates or the rate of warming, basically.
Yeah. So, what are the sorts of things that act as carbon sinks? And is there any sort of initial idea about why they might have tipped?
They were able to say that it was mostly to do with land sinks, but there's so many different things going on around the world in different places and in different oceans that it takes a lot of work to actually isolate things a bit more. So, for instance, we know that some countries like Finland stopped being a net carbon sink a long time ago, even though it has a lot of forests. And that is to do with the temperature increase. So it's probably in 2023 has a lot to do with the record surface temperatures. So a lot of forests absorb less when the air is warmer. So we have some clues about what happened in 2023, but we don't know all of the answers yet. But there are certainly different countries where that used to be net sinks that aren't anymore because of climate change, because of temperature change. I think in 2023, the only big forest in the world that continued to be a net carbon sink was in the Congo. But the Amazon wasn't either because it's been in a drought for a lot of 2023.
Yes, and chunks of it are still on fire. And that's not good for sinking carbon. It's more of a carbon emitter. Yeah. And just finally, Cathrine, we've got some new research out of Cathrine Lining, the Climate Change Commissioner, on offshore mitigation funding. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so Cathrine Lining works at Motu. Her expertise is around public policy. And so Motu is an economic institute. They do a lot of research. And this piece of research, Cathrine was the lead author, but there were other co-authors as well that are people at Motu. And they were looking particularly at the funding of offshore mitigation in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So this is something we've talked about a bit. If we want to meet our Paris Agreement targets for 2030, we are going to have to purchase a lot of mitigation from other countries because we don't have enough domestic mitigation to cover it. We've been a little slow to get going with that. And so some of the things that Cathrine Lining was looking at in this research is to understand what are the mindsets that are preventing that action from starting to happen, and also looking at what they recommend as a process going forward. So there's quite a bit of detail in there, but in particular, they identified 4 competing mindsets that they say are paralysing progress. this ranges from dismissive detractors, carbon colonialism, domestically driven, and least cost compliance, which is one of my least favourite topics that I've talked about before.
It sounds like the description of a government, but anyway, yep.
Yeah, so she's saying all of these are basically act as really narrow lenses on what is good for the country, what is in the country's own best interests. So it puts a very narrow interest on self-interest, basically, as a country, and that explains why we're not, getting behind that as much as we ought to be to date. And so with that research also, they kind of say, well, these are the next steps that we need to take in order to get in behind, contributing to global mitigation reduction, and what some of the benefits of doing so would be in terms of helping to accelerate global climate progress.
Fantastic. Cathrine Dyer, our climate correspondent with our weekly climate wrap. Cathrine, thank you very much. Ka kite anō, mā te wā.